Hello, my name's Hannes, this is Painting by Letters, and today we're going to start growing my new Necrons. So the second project on this channel is going to be the project of growing my Necrons. I must start with an admission, there are a lot of Necrons in my pile of shame. So I say there's a lot in my pile of shame for Necrons. There's what we'll be doing in this episode, and then there's these 3 boxes, really. So it's not a huge quantity, but realistically speaking, it's probably quite a number of weeks' work. So it does seem like at least a shameful quantity. So what is my army thus far? I thought it was probably worth going back over that and considering it as a whole. So I have the Necron half of the Indomitus box. Seems quite topical that, given that Leviathan's out literally the day after I record this audio. I could either be really happy or really sad next week when I talk about Indomitus. Never mind. We've got Trazyn the Infinite. We've got 5 Immortals that I bought just on a bit of a whim. We've got 3 Wraiths because I always wanted them. And we've got a Doomsday Arc. I said in an earlier video when I was starting this channel that one of the things that I wanted to do was to get ready for 10th edition. Obviously, 10th edition has come along slightly quicker than perhaps this channel was able to respond to, but nevertheless, there is still the need to grow my Necrons, I think, into a full 2,000 point army. This project will actually exist alongside another one, which will start next week, which will be collectively me preparing to play 10th edition. So what's in my boxes? I've got 5 Immortals in a box. I've got the Boarding Patrol box. I have the Void Dragon, which I bought on my Stag Do, true story. And the Silent King, which was bought for me by a very close friend for Christmas last year. Considering all of this, I think it's important probably to start small, to start with something manageable. And thus I picked the Immortals to begin. I think as an addendum, I'd also like to say one small point. I think I've let myself off the hook a little bit when it comes to improvement. When it comes to the models that I have repainted in our sort of fixing series, I was quite happy letting things stain and stuff like that because in my mind it's only really got to be battle ready or tabletop ready, I suppose. And I was quite happy to sort of let things escape me a little bit. And what I would like to do is I would like to think about some of the principles that I used in the Trazyn video and some of the things that I forced myself to do here that I ended up quite enjoying, and maybe consider during this project ways in which I could make sure that I'm continuing to improve what's going forwards. Anyway, there's quite a bit to get to with the Immortals, so I will go through the process with you now. So the first thing I did is I got the box out and just initially looked at the older model just to make sure that I was still sort of au fait with what it was going to end up looking like. Interestingly, I noticed that the box art is actually a very, very similar size to the end product. I don't know if that's intentional. I don't think I've ever noticed that before. Another thing I noticed is these kind of striations on the back. I was just a bit weirded out by them. I don't know why I chose to do that last time round. So I'm going to see if I can do something with that probably. So I cut everything out of the box and just started having a look round. I remember from the last time I built these that they're pretty nightmarish. The arms are a bit annoying to get into place and they're a bit annoying to pose as well, but nevertheless I went through the box instructions just to see what I could see, and it was pretty much exactly as I remembered last time. So next I just cut the pieces out of the box. I'm gonna keep this mostly fast other than this little bit here. The sprue connections on the shoulders of these guys is really genuinely very annoying. So between the different Immortals, I actually used slightly different techniques to clean the sprues around the shoulders, and every single time it's created a crack. Now I don't know if that's intentional by GW, but in both cases on both sides there's a sprue gate, meaning that there's always going to be some kind of misalignment. Sort of one of the things that GW wouldn't do anymore. You know, when you look at the modern stuff, usually they're really intelligent with where the sprue gates are, but in this case it's pretty abysmal. If you are thinking about getting some Immortals, keep an eye out for that one. Following the packet instructions, first I built the torso, then connected the weapon. These weapons are also pretty nightmarish for cleaning up mold lines. This set seems to have quite a few of them, but never mind. Once we've done that, then connecting the upper and lower body together and getting everything glued in place. One of the things that I do for a lot of my Necron units is I actually stick them down onto the bases straight away, because I quite like the control that I can have. Obviously, if this was a more complicated army, I would think about sub-assemblies or something like that. But in this case, I find the models are wide open enough that you can get away without it. So I sprayed these models silver literally the day after I did the Trazen model. So I got to use the lessons learned from that, and quite nicely, they came out much, much smoother. So next I just really quickly went over them in some Agrax Earthshade. Just a slight sepia tint to the metal I think just creates a bit of nice interest. The next step was to take some light silver from Vallejo and just dry brush these. Really it's more of an overbrush. I thought going forwards it's probably a point of improvement that I should continue with. So as well as using the dry brush just to go over and to provide a slightly brighter metallic colour, the specific highlights focusing on areas that would have caught an above light end up working really, really nicely to sell the entire effect. So I tackled the rib cages next, same as before, it's just a Vallejo blue colour. Just being very careful to stay within the lines and go over it there. This colour by itself I think is too bright, but when it gets washed out ever so slightly by the contrast, I think it works quite nicely. I picked a richer darker blue to go over the pipe work at the back. I really don't know how really one is supposed to make these work. I think the two blues are just too far away from each other. Where the blue was diluted with decent quantity of water, they're slightly too faded, whereas the ones that weren't quite as diluted, they're just a bit too strong. In no place do I think these really work. I did try and do my best to sort of blend them together using washes, things like that. It ended up being quite a number of coats of this Vallejo blue wash. It just did not take, it didn't help, it didn't add anything to it. Next I began painting the green shoulders. Obviously I've done this quite a lot in my videos thus far, but it is just a set of 3 Citadel paints. It came out really nicely on these guys, despite the fact that the shoulder panels just have this bizarre line down the middle because of where the sprue gates are, but never mind. So we use quite a rich dark green as an undercoat. After that I make a 50-50 mix of a lighter green and this base green, water that down a little bit and use it as a glaze. I found that by sort of striping out from the middle of the shoulder panels, it creates quite a nice transitional effect as well, where it gets sort of brighter and brighter and brighter towards the end. So the middle of a shoulder panel might only have 1 coat of this glaze, or maybe 2, whereas the outside edges could have 3 or 4. Just creates a really nice transition. I'm yet to find a good way to get this on camera, but I do really like the effect in person, so never mind. After that, I decided to take the lighter yellower green, which is sort of a moot green, and spend a decent amount of time putting some highlights on the model. The more I think about it, making sure that these shoulder pads look really, really good is quite important, I think, for this army, because obviously if you're staring down at the models, it is the most prominent aspect as well. The next thing I did is I took the blue contrast paint that I've been using on the skeletal bodies of the Necrons, and this time I decided to actually water it down somewhat. It's one of the things that I keep seeing sort of YouTube people do, and I'd never really experienced it that much before, and actually watering it down ever so slightly really got rid of lots of that staining quite simply and made the cleanup job much quicker, which meant that really I could sort of slowly coat the model with the new colour and then essentially just spend a couple of seconds wicking away a few of those bits that might have stained later on, and it worked really, really nicely to bring the whole thing together. In the last video where I was painting Trazyn, I talked quite a lot about how to build up the effects that I do on these weapons. Weirdly though, I don't think Trazyn was a particularly great model to demonstrate that. However, the process that I use for your sort of rank and file models is ever so slightly different. The reason for that is there is rarely the space on any of the parts that I'm painting in this way to really get that full transition of all 5 colours and then some highlights. Instead, I take it as a bit more of a 3-step process. So firstly, get those reds in and get it really vibrant, get it really strong. That could take 2 or 3 coats, something like that. Just make sure it's really punchy. After that, I water down quite heavily sometimes the orange and essentially use this in several steps, going over some of the higher edges. This creates a bit of a two-tone effect once you've gone over it a couple of times, because obviously each time that you're putting quite a watered down paint on, you'll be covering an ever so slightly different part of that red, which means that you create quite a nice but irregular transition. Next, I'll take the yellow, and in this case I will typically try and do this in sort of 2 coats. So I'm picking up the ridge surrounding the top of these kind of carbine tubes, canisters, I don't know, across the top. And the other thing that I'll do is I will try and go into that grill area and really make it obvious that there are yellow lines in there as well. By using the yellow to both pick out the detail at one end of the weapon, but also specifically to accentuate that kind of red-orange blend, creates a really nice sort of cohesive weapon, I think. Throughout this process, you will also see me actually mixing the different paints together in a few places. That's usually where I think something hasn't quite worked. I'll try and go back over in a bit of a mix. That's just a nice way to sort of go over the mistakes. The other thing that makes this effect work really well is that the paints that I'm using here, which are all Vallejo, have a really high gloss finish. So one of the things that's often talked about, if you've got a matte finish, your errors can't hide anywhere. There's nowhere for them to go. Where the glossier the finish gets, the more space you have really to make those errors, because the gloss will smooth over the transitions, and it means that in something like this where we're getting multiple coats of paint down and multiple colours very, very close together, we can make sure that any moments of imprecise brushwork are quite nicely restrained by the gloss finish. The next thing that I did is I picked a bit of a darker umber colour. Whenever I do basing, I like to paint underneath the base work because you never quite know what you're going to put over the top's going to do. I created a nice umbery colour and just went over the entire base in that, just to make sure that if anything came up, it wouldn't be too dramatically obvious where the mistakes were. At this stage, I got out the texture paste. One of the nice things about painting underneath is you don't have to go right to the edges. So this texture paste is actually really quite runny compared to other ones you come across. I can't really think of a good way to explain it. Other texture pastes that I've used are often very, very thick, and this is quite thin. As such, I was really, really worried actually that when it dried it was going to shrink quite a lot, because the Vallejo one that's much thicker does actually shrink a little bit when it dries, but this really didn't. I don't know what magic sauce AK Interactive have put into this stuff, but it was really nice to work with. And another little trick that I found is, because it says on the packet that it's water soluble, and I got a little bit here and there on the Necrons. You're always going to, with a process like this, get a little bit of water on your brush and you can just drop the water on wherever it is on the model and this stuff just flows away from it, and it made cleaning these models so easy as well. I've decided for myself previously, and I know I've discussed this in a video, that I do want to think about modelling techniques that are more traditional, I suppose, and I recently tried Geek Gaming Scenics and absolutely loved it. But for finishing my Necron so that it matches my other Necrons, I think this stuff is a glorious find. And if you're looking for a good texture paste, cannot recommend this AK one enough. AK Interactive themselves say that this paste takes 24 hours to dry. Worrying that there was going to really be no progress, despite the fact I knew when this video was coming out, never mind. I decided to fix that pipe work because I just was not happy with it. And I went over, initially the idea was in quite a thin blue. And what I was going to do is I was going to bring it to really close to matte and then go back over it again. The blue was just slightly opaquer than I was expecting, but given the fact that there'd been quite a few number of washes underneath, that probably does make sense even though the paint was thinned down. So I took this as a bit of an opportunity to just do them differently. And so what I did essentially was that I tried to think about where the light would be hitting and just started essentially wet blending into those blues to create some highlights. On one or two of the models this isn't quite as successful as it is on the rest, but the effect is so much nicer in the end. I ended up being really happy with this. I think if I'm ever doing pipe work again, I'd probably do it this way rather than what people often say. I think particularly online people really like the kind of painting in additional details and things like that, but for a model this small it just didn't really seem to work for me. I don't know if that's my hands aren't steady enough or something. Once I'd finished that process, I actually realised that that texture paste was rock solid, and I realised this off camera completely by accident by dropping my paintbrush literally into it. And I was really worried because these are my sort of finer, nicer paintbrushes, and nothing came back up. So I left it for about another 15 minutes, but at that point it probably would have only been about half an hour, 45 minutes, by the time it was completely rock solid. And then I decided to paint over the top of it. So the first coat is literally just a contrast paint straight out the pot. It's got a high density of very small surfaces. Seems to be perfect for contrast paints. Staining is almost what we're looking for here in a couple of places. I was really willing to let it have puddles and things like that in the end that would dry a different colour. Once that had dried, I just mixed a sort of pinky umbery colour on my palette and just started using my really small dry brush to go over the top. I then mixed an even lighter version of the same colour and just went back over the top again, but specifically focusing on the areas that had already caught the first dry brush. And because I'm not a heathen, I then painted over the rims in black straight out the pot because it only needs one coat. And once I'd done that, I just cut them off the painting bases. I had to clean up a couple of bits of black here and there, but nothing too bad, and then we're done. I'll round off by just saying thanks for watching. I've been Hannes, this has been Painting by Letters, and keep safe out there.